Good morning, everybody, and welcome to CDE's fourth webinar. We're delighted to have over 400 people registered for this event. Some quick house rules. Please, if you are not speaking, stay on mute. If you're a speaker, please keep your video on if you can, and unmute when you speak. We are recording this, and it will appear on the CDE website afterwards. So South Africa's lockdown and the risk-adjusted approach to its easing has been as strict as any in the world. What are the pros and cons? What are the costs and benefits of this approach? Are there other options to explore? Now, nobody knows how best to deal with the complex set of issues around COVID-19 and the health, economic, and social consequences of this. There is, of course, no playbook. There are very many unknowns, and perhaps more people should acknowledge this. These unknowns are greater in developing countries, which have different kinds of economies and less state capacity than richer countries. And there are further complications in South Africa with its enormous poverty, highly dense living areas, and millions of people with compromised immune systems. Without large-scale testing, nationally and regionally, it's very hard to know exactly what is happening concerning the infection and its rate of spread. On the other hand, we know that our economy is being devastated with GDP predictions ranging from -6% to -12% this year, and with predictions that our horrifyingly high unemployment levels pre-COVID are probably going to increase by anywhere from 1 to 2 million people. The situation of millions of South Africans who live in poverty or close to poverty is increasingly desperate. Restarting the economy is therefore the most vital issue facing South Africa today. It's not a simple question of saving lives versus economic restarting. We know that this pandemic will take more lives, unfortunately, and we know that economic devastation will not only destroy livelihoods, but lives as well. So we're 1 week into level 4 of South Africa's move to restart large parts of the economy and our society, and there is heated debate. Has South Africa adopted the right approach in what you might call a highly bureaucratic approach to restarting to unlock our economy? Do we have the capacity and the time to do this? Is there another approach for South Africa? One that is based far more on trust in big companies, entrepreneurs, small firms, service providers? A very different approach altogether. One that says everyone can reopen, demonstrate their safety measures and get going, except for identified firms or sectors because of exceptionally high risks. We have 5 well-informed participants in our webinar today. We've asked each speaker to talk for 7 to 10 minutes, and then we will have a bit of time for discussion. I'm going to start with Michael Jordaan, as he is not able to stay with us for long. Thank you very much for being with us. Michael, give us an entrepreneur's perspective on unlocking our economy.
Thank you very much, Anne, and hi to Stephan, Ayanda, and Neva. I feel honored to be on a panel like this and a little bit daunted by the quality of the audience. I have prepared 8 points that I'd like to make. I think it'll take me 10 to 15 minutes, and then of course I'm happy to take some questions. So the first one is, how does one deal with exponential phenomena? This is a fascinating topic. You all know the old story about the person who invented chess and then asked for 1 grain of rice on the first block, 2 on the second, and then doubled on the third one. It seemed when you start with 1 grain of rice that it won't be a lot of rice, but there wasn't enough in the world to pay the inventor of chess. And so we find that processing power in the world is doubling every 18 months to 24 months. That's Moore's law. That's another example of an exponential phenomena. And then, of course, there is the coronavirus. It is highly infectious, and it's therefore something that we are not intuitively set up to handle, a small thing that can grow very, very fast. And you have high modeling uncertainty. So we know it spreads fast, but we don't know where it would naturally peak. So that leads on to my second point is, how does one in this environment make decisions? And the best line that I've heard for this, but also in business, is the line, strong views that are weakly held. Okay, now, I think it was Mark and Wiesen who said it. That's actually quite a good way to think about life. You inform yourself as best you can, because you have to make, but it doesn't matter if new compelling evidence comes across that you can't change your mind. There's nothing wrong with weakly holding on to strong views. Now this way of thinking is particularly important in our environment. We have to have strong views because we're dealing with something that can kill. And clearly you want to make plans to stop people from dying if it's not necessary. But the weakly held also needs to be part of it, or humbly held, because we are learning more and more as every single day passes, and we need to be able to change our responses as we learn more. So, for example, there is a massive experiment happening where we know Sweden is more liberal, but the Chinese lockdown was quite extreme, everything from facial recognition to hunting down people who bought fever medicine and in chemists, etc. So we don't yet quite know which one is the correct approach, but in a few months' time, we'll know more. Certain things that, although if you're over 65, you have a higher chance of dying, or if you have comorbidities. But we're also learning interesting things, for example, that smoking seems to actually be beneficial. Normally smoking is a health hazard, but there are studies showing that, smokers are less affected. We've also recently learned from studies that transmission is unlikely to happen through kids. Now, if that is proven, one could, for example, argue that schools should reopen much sooner. What we do know is it's effective to wash your hands, to wear masks, and have social isolation. But we don't know for certain that a massive lockdown is necessarily the answer. We're learning more about treatments. It seems at this stage that the vaccination could be 12 to 18 months away. And it seems there are up to 200 variants of this disease. Now, I mentioned all these figures. All of us have been reading about them. Everybody's been using the time during lockdown to become an expert epidemiologist. And that was the word I even pronounced a month ago. But there's new information coming in. And while you can have strong views of what needs to happen and everybody's entitled to them, my appeal to everyone would be to hold them weakly, to be humble about your opinions, because we're still learning about this disease. So what do we know from business about making decisions in an environment that is highly uncertain? That's my third point. When you don't know everything, and you have to recognize it, the best is to not go with your gut or with your emotions, but to go to scientists, to find out what the actual facts are, what our hypotheses are, what are the things we know for certain. And when I say scientists, I'm not just talking the guys who wear white overalls. I would include in it, for example, economists, and I would, people who know what will happen to be human behavior if, for example, you have certain type rules. Second thing about decisions is when you need to make decisions and you know that you can unwind a decision quickly, it's also okay to make that decision quickly. But when a decision has long-term consequences, then you should wait a little bit more, take your time in making a decision. The next one is about decision-making is that you have to explicitly consider trade-offs. I mean, we have a great example here of where you can use a very blunt tool like a lockdown and you will save lives. But have you then explicitly taken into account all the other consequences of a lockdown, such as losing jobs or the isolation or loneliness that it can cause, etc. So you need to be very specific about trade-offs. And I find that quite absent in some of the debate. And then another one about decisions, and this is in the business world, maybe also in the academic world, but don't copy and paste, copy and adapt. To just say that we are going to take a playbook like it's happened in a rich country and apply that playbook in very different circumstances in South Africa, I don't think is appropriate. China and South Africa are very different. The food queues that we have, and we see where there's no social distancing, is a remarkable contrast to the complete isolation that you saw in the Wuhan province. Also in an emerging market such as ours, if people don't have money, it's just not an option for them to stay at home. So I would caution about copy and pasting decisions just from other countries. Because, and this is part of the trade-off, we know that at the extremes, poverty also kills. You know, this is not a debate. It's too easily cast as a debate of the economy versus saving lives. And then it seems that somebody who wants to open up the economy is callous about lives. That is not the case at all. If we don't get the economy growing, there will be deaths, but just from another cause, which could be hunger. The fourth point I'd like to make is that the initial lockdown that we had was, in my view, 99% correct. I'm just not saying 100 because I don't think we have scientific evidence of everything yet. We didn't have denial in the government, and we locked down early on. And we can contrast that with the United States, which is meant to be the leader in the world in so many things, but they were in denial and they waited far too long to take the action that South Africa did. By locking down early, we bought time to prepare. We are now understanding the virus a little bit better. We bought capacity to test and trace. Whether we've done that sufficiently is debatable. And the mere act of the lockdown in itself was a form of education, because then people are taking it very seriously. So I am supportive of the initial lockdown, and I know that you can have debates around whether it should have happened in the first place. The fifth point, though, is that it is now clear that the lockdown has led to massive economic damage. There are lots of estimates around, but you know, the one I align myself with is a double-digit reduction in GDP, 15 to 70, and up to 7 million jobs that can be lost, which is a calamity in a country like South Africa, where we have such a very high unemployment rate already. So it literally is taking the ability to earn an income for themselves away from people who are desperate and on the breadline. So uncertainty about the virus, but certainty about the damage that we're causing on the economy. So my sixth point is that we have to recognize that lockdowns, even the different levels of lockdown that we have in the country, all 5 of them, are very blunt instruments. And that there is potential to be smarter about this. Even if one believes in the risk approach, as one should, there are much smarter ways of doing it. For example, one could have a very tight lockdown on older people who are at higher risk, or anyone who's vulnerable at higher risk, but have a free flow of schooling, for example, for kids, if it is indeed the case that they are not big ones that are going to infect other people. I also think one should have a bias towards allowing any economic activity if proven that that economic activity is safe. So if any business can come and prove that people in business work very far apart, or it's a one-man or one-person firm who works in nature, I see no reason why those things, why we shouldn't have a bias to have those things allowed, because the lockdown right now is a very blunt instrument. When it comes to allowing certain type of online activity, the deeds office, for example, was just closed. Now, this is a brilliant opportunity to take something like a deeds office online, as some countries in the world have done. We should actually do far more to help schools do online schooling. I'm involved with one startup that has made all electronic textbooks for all grades available for free. This could be a wonderful opportunity to become a smartphone-only society. Let's get rid of all feature phones and set up all types of government activities through smartphones. And it could be everything from social grants to the way you transfer a property or the way you do your banking. So the conclusion I draw here is don't waste a good crisis. And I think to some degree, we've bought ourselves time, but we've squandered that time because we're wasting a good crisis. And then, and this may be my final point, which is advice for business. I'd advise all people out there to first look after themselves. It sounds selfish, but if you don't look after yourself and your own health, you can't look after other people. And then in your business, go back to first principles. This is a great time to think, what is the raison d'etre for your business? Who are your customers? What are the points of need that you're solving for? And then focus your business to just survive for the next 12 to 18 months. It's a very long time. I think we could be in this until a vaccine is found. And if I say survive, all you need to do is make sure that you have enough cash. What the implications are probably that you have to cut costs, also that you have to turn fixed costs into variable costs. When it comes to the price of your goods or services, I would reduce it because there's much lower demand out there. Some businesses will need to pivot completely, and there's some great examples of people who've done that. I would support staff, particularly if you have great staff. This is a great time to look after them. And then my final point, though, is if as a business you can survive over the next 12 to 18 months, the silver lining is that you will emerge much stronger because you'll emerge in an environment where some of your competitors will no longer be around. So don't try and be too smart in this environment. Just survive, get through this, and things will get better eventually. That's it from me, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thanks very much, Michael. I think the way we're going to go is sort of move through all the speakers, and we're going to not stop for any questions at the moment, if you don't mind. So I'm going to move.
Of course.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for that. A clear position. I'm going to turn now to Stephan Malherbe, who's been one of a number of people who's been advising government on how to unlock. Stephan, over to you. If you can stick to the 7 to 10 minutes, I'd be grateful.
Okay, I'll do my very best. And you know what you should do? When you get to the seven minutes, give me a warning, and then I'll stop in time. Can everybody hear me all right? Because I can also switch off my video if that helps.
Now you're coming through loud and clear. Proceed.
All right, good. Okay. So I'm going to do this in a sense from within the trenches, because that's where I find myself at the moment. But I really loved Michael's introductory remarks because it makes us realize that there's a much bigger canvas here, and also that there's a much longer future ahead of us to think about economic impacts and how we can pivot this crisis into an opportunity. The first thing I want to say from the trenches is that of 25 years of working in different areas of public policy, this is by a measure the most difficult challenge I've ever seen, and the most difficult set of decisions. So I know that people are quite frustrated at the moment at government. They're frustrated at level 4, which doesn't hang together. They're frustrated at not being able to buy cigarettes or wine, as I am, at least with wine. And they are frustrated at having to stay at home. And they think, isn't this all a massive overreaction? And there are people who cite, a number of deaths from HIV, from TB, from motor vehicle accidents. They say, well, we didn't stop the economy for any of these. And I just want to say, I think we should be more sympathetic than this, because nobody knows where this is going to end. And 6 or 8 weeks ago, when all of this started from a policy perspective, nobody knew how this was going to play out in developing countries, and we still don't really know. We don't know whether there's going to be a second wave. We don't know what's going to happen in informal settlements. We don't know what goes down in minibus taxis. So, and you're right, and Michael, you are right, the number of unknowns here is just extraordinary. And I'm personally quite frustrated by non-doctors who have become doctors overnight. One has to be anxious about that. And I'm also very anxious about modeling per se. I think good logical thinking is better than models. I've not seen a single model that I thought I could trust, either on the economic side or, for that matter, on the epidemiology side. But we have to act, right? And I think that the one thing that we realize is that lockdown cannot be an indefinite state. It's against human nature, but our economy and our society simply isn't strong enough for that. So what's the best practice for reopening? And if we were to start with the World Health Organization, they've actually got 6 requirements for when one can reopen again. In 3 of those, I think we're pretty good, hey? Transmission is controlled, so sporadic and clusters are controlled. The health system can manage the situation and has substantial reserves. Another one where we're good is that the risk of imported cases is managed well. I think we've done really well in that respect. And a third one in which we've done well is that communities are fully engaged. And I think all South Africans are fully engaged. So far we've got 3 out of 6. The other 3 are really interesting because it says, is there sufficient health capacity to detect and isolate all cases, which is detection, testing, isolation, quarantining. And we know that is not in place here, and I doubt whether it's in place in most advanced countries even. The second one is that the outbreak risks in high vulnerability settings are minimized. I think that's sometimes true, but sometimes not true. And again, I want to focus on those areas in the Western Cape that are suddenly seeing a massive exponential surge in cases, such as Klipfontein, Langa-Nyanga, and so on. And informal settings more generally are a risk of that. And then the last one is workplace preventative measures should be established. And I think on that one, the jury is out now. We'll come back to that. So we've got a real mixed report card at the moment. And I think we've got to recognize that. But we cannot stay closed until we get perfect A's on this report card. It's impossible. So how do we move from a quite unsatisfactory level 4 to the next steps? And I think I've only got a few minutes left. So let me just be very quick about that, and then we can discuss it in more detail later on. The first thing is, whilst a lot of people are now criticizing the level approach, we've got to know that this is still seen internationally as best practice. Whether we need 5 or 3 is a debate that one can have. But we are going to have a leveled approach. Now, this is not going to disappear. The problem with level 4 is that there are certain basic economic truths and logics that are not recognized. And if you look at manufacturing and importing and exporting, you can see that there are real problems there that I think the government can and will address in the next 48 hours or so. So I think one can have a better level 4. I wish one could move to a negative list right away in terms of we open everything except a small number and have stringent health controls. I don't think we know enough yet to go there. And I think it's highly unlikely that the National Command Council will want to take such a bold step. So we have to move to a much better level 3, and we have to move there quickly. And we have to do it in a way where there's a far greater differentiation between different areas. Because some areas in South Africa could virtually move to a level 2 or 1 right now. Others might need to stay at a level 4 for a longer time. So that differentiation is important. And then I think we've got to start building what I would call level 2, and that is that world where virtually all activity is allowed again, but there are stringent controls in place. And let me end off by just saying what I think the most important one is, and that is to have the ability to really quickly identify and isolate cases of explosive disease spread, and have the ability to lock those areas or situations down. Without that, we can't have a general reopening, because I think our set of realities is too broad and too wide, and there's too much of a chance of really dramatic outbreaks. But I think that's achievable. So those were first thoughts, Anne.
Great, thank you very much, Stephan, from the trenches, aptly put. I'm going to move to Neva Makgetla, who also has been in the trenches, as I understand it, and ask her to come in now. Neva, you're on mute.
I got that. Sorry, I'm just trying to do some slides. I'll be right there. So, and again, I would be grateful if you tell me when I'm over time. What I wanted to talk about here was what they've done in countries that have in fact successfully opened up. Except now I can't get this, sorry, I'm having a problem here. There we go. So what we did is we did case studies of South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, Denmark, Germany, and China, all of which have had formal or informal lockdowns, at least at local levels. So although they say South Korea didn't have a lockdown, in fact, they did lock down major cities. They all avoided high levels of contagion, so they did it early, and they brought the new cases down sharply. And they have all begun to reopen their economies in the last few weeks. I mean, obviously, just to say again what Stephen said, it was critical that they had early and strong health measures. They ended international travel early. They had various forms of lockdown, and they had very extensive screening, testing, tracking, and rigorous isolation of cases. In fact, I think when you look at it, I suspect it's the actual rigorous isolation of cases may be more important than the level of testing. And of course, success in reducing the new cases was a precondition for economic opening, which is what we've said here. And the one thing I would say, though, is I think all of them effectively see the public health measures as an investment in their social and economic future. So I don't think you can see them just as a cost. And I don't think you can see them in terms of static trade-offs. I think you have to say it's like any other investment. It costs a lot up front. It should pay off later. But I would say, and I think we as South Africans, having lived through, sorry guys, but Eskom and Sasol, for instance, no, they're just saying it's investment. If it's not efficient and worthwhile, it doesn't make it all good. So what did they do? Well, first, and obviously I was seeing this in terms of what did they do different from us. Firstly, they distinguished between industries based on the extent of public interaction. They didn't try and say which SIC codes could open up, which is what we've done in level 4. Yeah? On public-facing industries, that is, industries with consumers and the public on site, they faced very strict restrictions even after the economy was reopened. So in effect, they're not even seen as part of the economy in some ways. So they'll say, we opened up everything, but by the way, no cinemas, no sports, no recreation, no restaurants. And particularly recreational and personal services are still largely closed. Retail, often there's only curbside pickup. So it's not even about social distancing within the store. You have to go and pick your stuff up on the curb. Restaurants actually are more open, I think, because many of these countries are very restaurant dependent, but with very strict physical distancing. And public transport often opened late and is subject to deep cleaning. Now, the point is, again, social differences, most of these are areas where public transport, they're quite dense cities and public transport is not as critical. But what's interesting is that other producers are able to open up without quotas at all. So they have the same kind of rules we have for occupational health and safety, although they have stronger rules in many cases about getting the contacts of workers and visitors so you can do contact tracing, also about staggered shifts, partly to reduce contact at work, but also to reduce the rush hour and more temperature screening. But what's also interesting is they use the existing occupational health and safety systems, which include both having employees sign off, because workers obviously have an interest in this, but also requiring better communication and training of employees. And then again, of course, they have the rigorous public health measures, especially, as Stephen said, to identify and manage hotspots. But I think one thing they do is they make it much easier to quarantine people, because honestly, the biggest spread in Wuhan was in the home. Yeah? And I think that's true most places. And the second biggest is public transport. So the argument is try and get people out of the house, but then also give them support. Some of them are even giving people daily cash allowances while they're in lockdown and while they're in quarantine. So if you look at this as a risk assessment, what they're really saying is this: the biggest risks are home and then residential services like jails, old age homes, things like that. Yeah? Public transport is a risk, and work with public contact is a risk, although it can be managed. Work without public contact is actually relatively easy to risk. They're organized spaces where you have stakeholders who are interested also in protecting themselves. So it's done in this form to say you leave home, you get on public transport, those are your biggest risks. Being at work should not be such a big risk unless you're actually in direct contact with the public or you're working in some kind of residential setting. What are the implications for level 3 for South Africa? Well, just to flag, obviously the decision on whether we go to level 3 will depend on the risk, and it should vary by region. As Stephen said, Cape Town is really looking bad at the moment, far worse than the rest of the country. And as long as that's there, I don't see how you can open up. But the implications would be this. We would just say all non-public facing economic activities could reopen as long as they abide by occupational health and safety rules. We've got existing occupational health and safety rules. We can add, there are some already, we could strengthen them. The public health regulations for COVID-19 in the workplace. We could say where workers aren't organized, other stakeholders could undertake inspections. So you increase the number of people looking at workplaces to make sure they comply. You have a hotline for employees and customers that people obviously have to respond to as opposed to one of these toy telephones. And obviously you would need safe market access. And this is important because there's no point saying you can produce clothing, but you actually can't sell it. Yeah? And so the implication of that is that you actually need more e-commerce, not less. Where you would go slow is with public-facing activities and residential services. Now, obviously, residential services mostly didn't shut down, but you would want to be very careful with them. It does at that point depend on how society values specific activities. And I mean, honestly, different countries and states in the US have defined essential services as, you know, health, groceries. In some places in the US, it's guns. In Florida, it's professional wrestling. And in California, it's marijuana shops are considered essential. So you see, we're missing out. And Stephen, every single state in the US, except Pennsylvania, says alcohol is an essential service. So they were allowed to stay open. But where they're open, you really have to be careful about the distancing for both customers and staff. And the one thing I'd like to raise is that that also means staff, for instance, need to have areas where they can take a break and be physically distanced. Because very often those places aren't provided and then people will talk to each other. Public transport is a really weak link for South Africa because of the historic residential patterns. Bigger companies can hire private transport, but it gets expensive. I think this is something where this is a public good. Government has to ensure there's physical distancing, both in the taxis and in the taxi ranks, as the price of opening up. And I think that that has to be rigorously enforced by municipalities and provinces. That's their job. It's not a national job. And then finally, obviously, as Stephen said, none of this works without the public health measures. And the really critical thing is there has to be an urgent response when you see things going up. So it's not just monitoring, but it's responding quickly when you see things going wrong and having the power to enforce isolation where people are endangered. So the economic impacts, if we were to open up in this way, we'd have 4 million more people permitted to go to work. So we'd be at 75% of the employment levels in 2019 being permitted to go to work if you include working from home. Most of the restaurant, personal services, and retail. But remember, the recovery won't be as good as that, very likely, both because there's limited domestic and international demand, and like tourism and recreational activities are not going to recover for a while. And there's a cash crunch in many businesses because of the lockdown. So you need measures to address that. That includes, we have to continue with strong measures for people who are unable to go back to work. We really need to think about what would be a just transitions for industries where there is no short-term solution. And I would include tourism in that in particular, but also a lot of recreational things like events management, sports, and so on. We need government support with liquidity challenges generally, but for SMEs in particular, for the cost of meeting these sanitation and health requirements. Okay, my last sentence, and in the long run, we need a stimulus package. Round of Boha.
Thank you very much, Neva. I would have given you a bit longer, but thanks for closing.
No, it's fine. That was my last sentence.
Great. Okay, I'm now going to turn to Ayanda, who's been involved in this process, as I understand, as well as thinking about how to do all of this from a Hulamin perspective. Ayanda, over to you.
And thank you for just this opportunity to be in this great presence of an esteemed panel like this. We've been in the trenches. I'll steal your concept, Stephan, and just say it's really been learning at speed and learning while fixing. I would also agree with Michael's point earlier that we are absolutely allowed to change our minds as we learn and to adapt ourselves accordingly so that we can get to the kind of responses that this kind of crisis is placing upon us. My comments will really be confined, yes, to a Hulamin perspective, but I'll also just request your indulgence to also include what we've learned through the manufacturing circle, which I'm also part of, through the research that we've run through them. So I think the more you hear people giving feedback and mostly complaining about how inconvenient this is, especially at firm and sector level, is the more you worry about whether do we realize that there's almost a mile that we have to travel, not only to meet government's decision-making halfway, but in a bottom-up approach kind of way to make it possible for government to feel more empowered to take the decisions with confidence, because we are able to demonstrate our readiness at firm level. So by this, I mean, there is a level of granularity that is only going to be achieved in the fight of this pandemic by us as individual firms and individual sectors being able to proactively be accountable, so that we can be able to elevate the information up. That way, as government moves from one level to the next, they are not just basing it on how loud we are complaining, but on how ready we are proving to be and how much we are able at our own levels to be able to deal with the effects of the pandemic. From a Hulamin perspective, we took a decision quite early on because we were part of the essential services. We decided that we were going to test. And that was because, obviously, not being doctors, and mostly metallurgical engineers, we had too much conflicting information regarding how do you actually know when a person is actually positive. And even though we were aware of the onerous nature of this and the fact that it was going to be costly, I would go to Neva's point about us consciously deciding early on already that this was an investment that we were willing to make. And so we have, over the period of a month, tested in excess of 1,800 of our employees. We have 2,311 in total. And we have had so far 4 cases. And our first 2 cases we got at just the 1.5 test mark. And this is what was interesting about what we learned. What we learned is that of the 2 cases that we got initially, both of them were asymptomatic, meaning they're not displaying any signs of temperature or anything like coughing, etc. And I know that there is a standing opinion that is medical that says you can't test people without symptoms. But what this has helped us with is that if we had not tested these, our employees would not have known otherwise. And I think I leave it really to, we've had the similar discussion to the medical fraternity, and in the end, we can only leave it to the medical fraternity to continue to guide us and give us more reliable information about, if you can't really pick up otherwise, how then do you know with certainty whether a person is negative or not? And we have not only used for our own employees, we have extended it to providers of service. So truckers and other deliverers of service, as we moved into level 4, who are coming into our premises, we've made sure that we help them to participate in a testing program and we keep everybody accountable. All the other aspects, like switching from biometrics to a card system, making sure that there is deep cleaning in between every session. In fact, we've made sure now that at the end of every day, we try to deep clean most of the common areas so that we just minimize that whole issue of shutting down completely and then deep cleaning completely every time you have a patient. So we've had 2 more patients. Those are under quarantine. Our tracking and tracing system is much improved from our previous experience. And because the next 2 happened while we had the lockdown the first time, it was very easy for us to pull back systems and scenario plan better for our ability to respond. So it's our responsiveness as industries, as firms, as companies, and our ability to filter that information about the cases we're having and our ability to respond to those that I think is going to give government the confidence to know whether it's easy for us to move from a level 4 to a level 3. I agree that there are companies that are already quite ready to move through the levels. I also agree that the issue of a negative list would actually possibly expedite, but I think in the absence of a very sector-driven compliance, accountability, openness program, it's going to be really difficult for government to make a decision that we are going to all agree with and not have a spike. At the same time, I think we have a very unusual opportunity. You know, typically when we are having discussions between government and business and labor, you find that it's in an antagonistic environment. And unlike any other situation in our past, we are pushing towards the same solution, which is keeping the economy afloat and making sure that we try to address those areas in our industrial policy that are disabling. We have to take an opportunity of not wasting this crisis and making sure that we start building and solutions that are post or from level 2 forward. We have to be able to put together a section of solutions that are going to assist firms to inform sectors better and assist sectors to inform association better and associations to be able to inform different government departments. It is a responsibility that we can take. And at the same time, it is going to be critical for us to start looking at those things where we got very exposed. For example, the issue of national sufficiency from a localization point of view, as well as just how we use our ability as export organizations to create value-adding profit for and more employment for our different sectors. So I do think that it's going to be very critical going forward for each one of our subsectors and each one of the firms that are within those subsectors to come up with a plan that is much clearer in terms of compliance, in a way, sort of roadmap your way between where we are now in level 4 all the way to level 2 and be prepared to continuously account. Otherwise, you know, we will continuously complain about things not coming together and us not being able to push on the things that government is requiring of us. I think the last point perhaps that I can mention is that in the light of the fact that the unintended consequence is poverty, which is growing at an alarming rate, it is really critical for us to be able to build a stronger case for a quicker reopening. Perhaps we can move faster through the levels and stop at level 2. But if we don't do that, otherwise we will start moving into situations where it's going to be really difficult to recover. Already by the time we ran our first survey, which was around the first 2 weeks of the lockdown, it was very clear that organizations within the manufacturing space were already struggling quite a bit. And so it is going to be critical for us to just make sure that the movement between levels is quick, but the responsibility to make sure that that happens, I think, lies equally with us as it does with government. I think I will stop there for now.
Great, thanks very much, Ayanda. Our last speaker is Theuns from FirstRand, and who's also been involved in the trenches, thinking about how to unlock. So Theuns, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Also, just thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel. If anything, I've actually learned a lot, and I also just want to express my gratitude listening to some of these panelists in the trenches on the work that's actually being done. I think as a society, this is quite an interesting time in society, putting together and getting the best ideas on the table is actually a privilege for us to actually observe. As the last speaker and as a macroeconomist, I think, and listening to your comments at the start, I'll probably circle back to some of that and maybe provide a little bit more detail and color around some of the opening comments in terms of just the trade-offs between the opening up of the economy, the costs of opening up too fast or too slow. Maybe a few points to think about as well. And I think in that regard, I really enjoyed a comment made in a presentation by, it's a presentation that's doing the rounds, and I'm sure each of the panelists here have seen that, probably a lot of people on the call. But what stood out for me was that comment from Ricardo Hausman that said, we made the point that, that at the limit, people will have to decide between a 10% chance of dying from the virus or a 100% chance of dying of hunger. Okay. And I think that is exactly the trade-offs that we have to deal with here. Stephen, one thing that I took from your presentation is that one must be absolutely clear that we are not at the limit at the moment. We are somewhere at the start and moving towards the limit on either sides, either the health distribution and the macroeconomic distribution. And we really don't have all the information on the table. But, and as Michael pointed out, I think we'll really do damage to society and ourselves if we don't use the information that come at us as quickly and as good as possible. I think to substantiate some of the points, and I think this is obviously part of my work, and I think a lot of this gets communicated quite well at the moment, the trade-offs. But I think it's useful to just revisit some of the recent experiences and data at this point. So, I mean, at lockdown level 5, so which we have experienced over the last few weeks up to last week, is that the spread of COVID-19 disease, if we look at the curves on our side, I mean, South Africa really stands out as having had a good experience there. The spread of the reported cases looks better than other countries in a similar stage as China, South Korea, UK, US, Iran, Germany, etc. However, when we estimate the cost of the economy, when we just look at not even the cost, just how much of the economy could function under level 5 and not functioning, available to function, it seems to be as if it's around 50% of the economy were able to function then. I think I just want to make another point that one of the previous panelists made, is one must be extremely careful in this environment to rely too much on models and too much on point estimates. So when one says 50%, I think the point that one wants to make is it's quite a big part of the economy that couldn't function under lockdown level 5. And it's and that one should be mindful. And there's also a big dispersion in that activity. So, I mean, you would expect, you're looking at what was allowed, etc., that utilities, agriculture, etc., was able or at least could function at a higher degree than retail, etc., would as well. And then within our institution, we are privileged to have high frequency data as well. And it actually confirms a lot of these expectations that one would wanted to see, as for example, or that one thought you would see. Looking at the high frequency daily data that we have at our that's available for us, is we could see that restaurants and eating out basically functioned at less than 5% of where it functioned a year ago. Now, that's what you would expect as an economist, but the moment you see the data, it actually hits you. The lockdown worked, lockdown 5 worked because only 5% of the restaurant industry worked. You actually want to ask, why did 5% actually still function if under lockdown 5? But then groceries, etc., grocery areas functioned at a level of 70%. So I think that just confirms that there is costs, economic costs involved with this. At level 4, we expect that about 60% of the economy will be able to work. But if we look at our forecast, and I think this is where the trade-offs comes in, and not forecast scenarios, I think one must be very careful with forecast at this point. But scenarios suggest that if we run at level 4 for the rest of the year, the economy will probably contract by more than 30%. If on the flip side, but then we will be healthy. I think that's the point. So then we won't have, or at least the COVID-19 fallout will be much, much lower. I think it's another debate whether we will be healthy on different fronts. But on the flip side, if we move straight to level 1, then we will have health consequences. But the impact on the economy would probably be a contraction of somewhere between 0 and 5%. We will still have to deal with the fallout of the rest of the world, the financial market fallout that we have experienced at the start. So regardless of where we end up, there would be damage to the economy. And I think just to make this a little bit more real, is when the economy contracts, there's damage. And Anne, you pointed out, and other panelists pointed it out. You look at 1 million jobs, possibly, and possibly even more, that would be lost. Something that hasn't been mentioned here, and one can have a whole different panel on whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing, etc. But we are going to sit with fiscal debt issues. We are going to sit with fiscal problems. I mean, the government didn't have a choice but to push through stimulus. The Reserve Bank didn't have a choice but to push through stimulus. I, for one, think those were the right measures to put in place. But when one look into the future, one must acknowledge that there will be costs involved with that. And when you plan, if you run a business, etc., if you run a household, it's important to understand that there's going to be a fiscal cost and fiscal issues that will have to be dealt with. And I mean, we can build a list of costs, etc. One of I think it's important for us to just also note that there will be opportunities. Okay? And I think one of the opportunities that I think as you sit in the midst of the eye of the storm, I think we must also acknowledge that the rand is weak. We must also acknowledge that China is opening up, and China is one of our bigger export partners. The rest of the world will experience quite a bounce next year, and that is opportunities that I think businesses should look out for and see if they're able to actually unlock that. Then there's also a golden opportunity at this point to accelerate the reforms that we've been speaking about for so long, because those reforms can directly and indirectly create jobs. I mean, some of the obvious ones, or maybe it seems obvious, is renewable energy reform. I mean, that food manufacturing. And then there's other opportunities that starts to shed light. I mean, what about food manufacturing, the medical manufacturing? Somebody like Michael and Stephan and Neva will probably understand better how that would work on a micro level. But I think it's important that we look at how we can unlock these opportunities in these times. And then just finally, as far as the risks are concerned, I mean, we must, or I would acknowledge, and I think we all must acknowledge that the measures taken with the lockdown up to now was necessary. And measures taken to open the economy up gradually over time, or fast over time, with all the information that we have, is necessary. But there's also a risk associated with misallocation of capital when you actually centralize the control of the economy in the opening up for too long. And I think that's just something that one should keep an eye on as we move into the future over the longer term. Thanks, Anne. I'll leave it there.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think we've had a very rich set of contributions. I'm going to been watching the Q&As coming through and raise some of the questions that underlie them and some of mine from the presentations. I think there seems to be a general view that the initial very tough lockdown was dead right, and that the big debate is how we get the economy open as quickly as possible with as few health consequences, and how we balance that. So my first question really is, in terms of the unlocking of the economy, do you think business has been heard and listened to? I hear talk of it's time for the balance of power to move from the securocrats to the more economic departments. What would people's view be about that? Were business heard in the discussion on how South Africa unlocks and the debate now about level 4? And the second is, in this approach we've taken, is there sufficient capacity in government to, I think Michael said, you know, we have to learn as we're doing, and we have to respond quickly and change very quickly. So building on what Ayanda was saying, could a sector, for example, say, we're ready to open. We've got the health kind of provisions in place, and we're ready to open. Can we go faster than another part of the economy? Obviously, for bigger firms, it's much more complicated when you start talking about small firms. And they're the ones that have the least resources to deal with, if you like, the bureaucracy and to wait. So how do we speed this up? Does the state have sufficient capacity? Can sectors go faster? Let me ask anyone on the panel who wants to come in. Perhaps Stephan wants to comment, and then anyone else.
Yeah, so that's a lot of questions, Anne, in one, but they're important questions. And I think the first thing is, has business been heard? Well, business has certainly contributed and spoken, you know, in a whole bunch of ways. The Solidarity Fund, the Business for SA grouping, the Manufacturing Circle, and Ayanda's work. And many individual businesses have dedicated some of their most senior people to helping to solve this problem. So certainly it's been some of the best cooperation between business and government officials at a technical level that I think I've ever seen. But that doesn't mean that business had or actually should have a seat at the table when these decisions are being taken. These decisions are ultimately government decisions. And I think the honest truth is that they are only taken partially in a technocratic way. I think they are also taken in a political way, and we don't always understand where those come out. I think government has become a lot more sensitive to the humanitarian, the social, and the economic threats that are posed by an extended lockdown. So I think this picture of it's all health and securocrats, I think is a little bit outdated. And I think everybody wants to find a way of moving into the future. And then if I could just say this, I think the point that was made earlier, which is that the more ready businesses are, the quicker this will happen, I think is true. I think that is a critical element. And if I could just say this, for businesses that are figuring out how to reopen and how to prepare, there's a site, returntowork.co.za, and the 2 in that title is a digit that has lots of resources for individual businesses as well as sectors to prepare.
Great, thank you. Neva, perhaps you'd like to come in, talk a bit about, do you think unions have been consulted well or sufficiently? How do you see this whole issue of, I don't know, the Virgin Compact working?
I mean, there is a NEDLAC process, and I think it's functioning. I don't know that they've thought enough about how to manage the issue, discuss the issues around the lockdown. I mean, the one thing I just wanted to say is where I think companies and unions need to think more is we have quite a strong occupational health and safety system in place. And part of my concern is we seem to be not thinking about how do we use that in this context. So I would really encourage everybody to go look at the New Zealand COVID website, where besides the fact that they talk to people as colleagues rather than, you know, subordinates, what's interesting about it is they say we've got health and safety rules. We just need to make them work. The problem with our health and safety rules has always been smaller companies where they don't really exist. And I would argue that you need to then say, how do you mobilize additional resources? Because as with any risk management system, you need to start with monitoring. Yeah? And I think the question is where you don't have health and safety committees, you know, what are alternative systems that will work? So it's not just up to the employer. And if they flout it, you know, an inspector may come by every 20 years.
Ayanda, do you want to come in on any of my many questions?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Anne. I absolutely would agree with Stephan that heard there's been a visible demonstration of being heard. And I think we've been given ample opportunities to take initiative, particularly in the manufacturing space, and also to propose solutions. And I do believe that it's an unprecedented opportunity, but it's also an opportunity that I think we should take advantage of, not only to be heard alone, but also to infuse what we believe the future is going to look like. On the unions front, Manufacturing Circle, we actively engaged unions before we even submitted our opinions or the outcomes of the surveys that we ran and were assessed by TIPS, etc. Before we even sent those up to the DTIC, we made sure that we engaged directly with NUMSA, which is the biggest union in our space. And I don't recall a time in history where getting to a point of agreement has been that easy, where we are both prioritizing lives, but we're also prioritizing the importance of highlighting what should be happening in the economy. And I think we should, perhaps to Theuns' point at the end, we should use this opportunity of this agreement, the state of agreement that we are in, not only to fine-tune our solutions around COVID-19, but we also must use it to try and figure out together, how do we move forward? We are so used to being on opposite sides of the fence that we must take this opportunity to move forward together. So decisions, yes, have to be political, unfortunately, sometimes, but it is possibly the best cooperation period that we've been in a long time.
Thank you. Theuns, anything you want to add to the unlocking debate?
No, and I think I'll just make so what I'll just add is, I think we're in a state now where government will facilitate and needs to facilitate the opening up of the economy, and hopefully as safely and fast as possible. But then to Ayanda's point there, I think what we must keep in mind is that South Africa has an extremely capable and very strong, at least before the crisis, business sector. And if one actually looks at how seemingly all the different parts of society is putting together at the moment, it is an opportunity to once we are open and running again, for business to do what business really can, and support government with its social initiatives by creating employment and creating businesses, etc. I think it's an opportunity that we shouldn't lose as a country.
Unmute. Thanks for that. I want to ask a question. So I'm often puzzled by how little we know about what's going on in South Africa. And listening to the Premier of the Western Cape on the radio the other day, he was objecting to being called a hotspot. He said, we're not a hotspot, we're just testing more. And I think in a society where we have ramped up some of the health capacity, which is great, but we're not testing nearly enough, it seems to me. And I'm not sure it's possible for South Africa to test, magnitudes greater than we are already. And there are a lot of people in America and elsewhere in very different circumstances saying you have to test much, much more. That's sine qua non. But in a developing country, we don't have that capacity. So the one question is, I stressed this at the beginning, I think a number of other people stressed it, it's how much we don't know. So I don't feel like I know exactly what's happening around the country in terms of social distancing. You see pictures on Twitter, you see an article about a place in the newspaper, but in terms of a general view of what's happening in many towns and townships and informal settlements all over the country, I don't feel I know enough. So my first question is about data. Do we have enough? Is there anything more we could be doing realistically? And the second would be about transparency. Do we have a sufficient transparency in your view about the government game plan in a very difficult situation? So perhaps as we start to round off, if anyone has views on the data and what we don't know, and also transparency, or even if there is a game plan in this very, very difficult situation. Who would like to disagree with me or whatever? Final comments, everyone. Ayanda, you look like you're ready to talk.
I think, and it is the right concern to have about data, because my personal conclusion, and this conclusion I've shared with the manufacturing circle and with Hulamin, is that for as long as data is not available, it is going to be difficult for government to have the confidence to know whether we are moving in the right direction, like progression direction in terms of this risk-adjusted model. We don't have enough information, but we have the capacity to have more information, because if more and more industries are taking responsibility, and I'm saying this in inverted commas, to assist in providing more reliable information, I think we'll be better. I'll make an example. There was last week when we were assessing the testing that we did at Hulamin versus the statistics of the testing that was done within the province in KZN, we found that the amount of tests that we had done were just upwards of 6%. So in other words, I think within provinces, industries can be able to look at whatever is happening within the province and delineate their specific contribution. Because in the absence of reliable figures, I really think it's going to be very difficult to make a determination what's good for level 2 and what's good for level 4, and how do we make that migration.
Great, thank you. Neva, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say, firstly, I actually, by all accounts, we have better data than most developing economies. I mean, we have, because of TB and HIV and so on, we have better screening, testing, tracing facilities than most people. And I think the real problem is something else. And I think that the economists who want to have, like in the US, Romer wanted to have, I believe, between 5 and 20 million tests a day. And it's just not possible. So if we're going to fall back on saying we need to test everybody, like every few weeks, we won't get there. I do think that the thing that is worrying me more than the data, and the data are there. I mean, we just did a thing on the Western Cape where you can see the data are there and they're getting better. But the real thing that worries me is this. There is clearly a hotspot in the Western Cape. And to be blunt, it's clearly in the big informal settlements in Cape Town. Yeah? I mean, their cases are growing 10% a day. In the rest of the country, they're growing 2% a day. Yeah? And they've got a 10% positive rate on their tests coming back. In the rest of the country, it's about 1.5%. And to me, that says there's clearly a hotspot. The real question is, why are they not recognizing it? Why is it not being recognized at national level? And why is nobody saying? Because if we're serious about reopening the economy, what is critical to manage the risk is when you see something going wrong, you step in and stop it. The nature of this thing is it's very, very quick, fast spreading. And if you delay because you're worried about sensitivities or you just can't believe it's happening to you, then you end up with a much worse situation than if you start now. The advantage South Africa has is because we locked down early, we're actually at a very low level compared to most other countries, despite the increase in the Western Cape and a slow increase in other areas. But we could lose that quickly if we don't really say, critical to this is, doesn't matter about sensitivities, doesn't matter about politics. We just need to respond when we see that red line going up.
Great, thank you. Stephan, do you want to come in?
I'm just unmuting. And I'll say something in a moment about data and transparency. My big sort of final points would be to agree with Neva and to agree with Ayanda about what I think are two critical points. I think Ayanda's point that businesses large and small in their hundreds of thousands of individual enterprises should really come to the party to prepare properly, I think is such a fundamental point. It changes the nature of the debate and the discussion, and it makes it a lot easier to open up. So for me, that's maybe the biggest point of today. And then the second really big point, I think, is Neva's, that we need to understand what's going on. It needs to be reliable. The data needs to be reliable, and then we need to act quickly when we see any kind of uptick or explosive activity, as we are now seeing in the Western Cape. With respect to transparency and data, I think there's a significant degree of transparency. I haven't seen any deliberate high-level efforts to hide anything. I think it's been the opposite. But, and this takes us to the data side, people keep saying that we are uncertain about whether the data that comes through from public sector hospitals is entirely reliable. And on the testing side, I think there are also fears that we don't have a full grasp of the quality of data. I don't know whether those are justified concerns, but one way or another, we can't go through this crisis without high quality data, and it can perhaps precipitate a revolution in what we see as data. So firms like Theuns's bank, FirstRand, have access to high frequency data that's just extraordinary, and should be used in a much more proactive way by society and government to make economic and other decisions.
Theuns, a final quick word. You've got a minute or so.
Okay, yeah, and I think the point that I'll just make there is, I mean, maybe just to confirm or what Stephan said is, I mean, so as an economist standing back and looking into the data that's available in the firm, so how suddenly this crisis has forced us to look at the data that we have available was actually fascinating. And I also think there's going to be a whole different revolution in terms of how we use data. And if I look at the data that we have in terms of social migration, etc., how people move from outside of Sandton into Sandton, across the plains from Western Cape into the city, etc., it is fascinating. And it's just the way it's going to be used and how we can aggregate it across different firms, etc., in a way that is a way that society will find it palatable. Is going to change going forward. And I think it will add a lot to this debate and into future debates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Theuns. This has been, I think, a fascinating discussion. I've certainly learned a lot. And thank you to the speakers. Thanks for your time and for participating today. And thanks to all the participants. CDE will, if we do produce a short document summarizing your views, we'll make sure to check with you that we haven't got anything wrong. So rest assured, we won't just bring something out. Thanks very much, everybody, and keep safe. Thank you.